He recognized that it wasn't just the Israelite army that Goliath was defying. It was God himself. This giant had the nerve to stand up to God himself. He recognized that God was on their side. And if God was fighting for them, nothing, not even this seemingly unbeatable giant could stand in their way. Does that sound like any other New Testament scriptures you're familiar? If God is for us, who could be against us? Who could stand in our way? If God is on our side, nothing, not even this guy who appears to be completely unbeatable, not even he can stand in our way. And the Bible reveals to us over and over again that our spiritual enemy, is a master of deception. It's what he does best. He's a master of deception. In fact, over and over again, when you see Satan revealing himself, a lot of times you don't see him. We picture the devil, right, with horns and a pitchfork and like, oh, I'll know it if I see the devil. No, he disguises himself. A lot of times he disguises him. He looks like an angel. There are several scriptures you can read where he's a master of deception. And when he places in front of you a giant, a seemingly hopeless, unbeatable situation, recognize the lie and know the truth that if God is for you, nothing can stop you. If God is fighting for you, nothing can stand in your way. Declare the truth of God's word that all things are possible for him. Who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God? And so word gets back to King Saul that David is saying these things. And he calls for David to come to him. So David now journeys to go see King Saul. And he says this, don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul. I'll go fight him. Verse 33, don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. But David persisted. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I have done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. Verse 37, the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. Which brings us to our second important battle strategy, and that's this. Don't listen to the naysayers, but remember your God stories. Don't listen to the naysayers, but remember your God stories. See, whenever God begins to move in your heart and you recognize the lies of the enemy and you begin to grab hold of the truth of God's word and you begin to feel empowered to overcome the giants that stand before you, know this, that it will not be uncommon for the enemy to send naysayers to try to convince you of your inability to do it. Okay? Like David. David comes into this situation and he recognizes, he sees this giant for what it is. He's seeing the same situation everybody else is seeing. And yet he sees the situation totally different. He recognizes the lie of the enemy. That this giant, as big and scary as he seems, is nothing compared to the God I serve. He recognizes that truth. And he begins to feel empowered. And he goes to King Saul, empowered enough that he goes to the king of Israel. This nobody, this shepherd boy, goes to the king of Israel and says, look, don't worry about this guy. I'll go and fight him myself. And the king basically laughs at him and says, who do you think you are? You're just a tiny little puny little boy. How in the world will you ever defeat this guy who's been a warrior since his youth? And look at him, he's huge. And the same thing, when we face these situations that seem impossible, they seem insurmountable, like we'll never overcome these things, these giants in our own lives. You may get to a point where you start to recognize the fact that, man, God is bigger than this thing. and you start to recognize the lie of the enemy. This isn't too big of a situation for my God to overcome. And you start to feel empowered to say, man, I can do this. I can overcome. God can be victorious in this situation. Don't be surprised if in the midst of when it seems like you're climbing out of this thing, it feels like, man, God might be doing something. If somebody comes along and says, who do you think you are? Look at the reality of your situation. Look at where you are. Look at where you've been. There is no way you could ever overcome this thing. Just give in to it. The naysayers will come. The enemy will send them. But we need to recognize, we need to make a choice not to listen to the naysayers, but to remember our God stories. Because remember, it's not about you, is it? And so when the naysayers come, they're going to try to convince you of your inability. And you should say, great, you're absolutely right, I can't do it. But it's not about you. It's about what God can do through you. It's about Him. It always has been about Him. So don't focus on the words of the naysayers, but reflect and remember all the times that God has been faithful and brought you through. And that's what we see David doing, don't we? Remember the things that he's done. Remember your God stories. I mean, David was no dummy. He had to be fully aware of how he sized up to this giant. He had to be fully aware of his own size and strength and his own inability to fight against this giant. Okay, I'm sure David was fully aware of that. But David's confidence, he was not in himself. David's confidence was in God. And that's a huge difference. His confidence was not in himself, it was in God. And he remembered all the times that God had delivered him before. And he trusted and believed that God would do it again. As he said in verse 37, the Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from the Philistine. I mean, David obviously had some boldness. This wasn't the first time he had come up against a tough situation. He begins remembering these stories of out there with sheep. And most shepherds, man, when the lions or the bears come, it's like, oh, well, sorry, see ya. We just lost a sheep. Too bad. But not David, no. He's going after the bear with a club and beating it over the head. And there had apparently been these times before where God had been so faithful and delivered literally with his own two bare hands. He killed bears and lions. That doesn't get you charged up and excited. I don't know what will. So he remembers his God stories. He remembers all the times that God had been faithful, and he believes with all his heart God can do this again. So recognize the lies of the enemy and know the truth. And don't listen to the naysayers, but remember your God stories. So Saul eventually consents, and he gives David permission to fight against the Philistine giant. Let's read on then in verse 38. It says, Then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off again. And he picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you come at me with a stick? And he cursed David by the names of his God. Come over here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals, Goliath yelled. 45, David replied to the Philistine, You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head, and then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. And that brings us to our final battle strategy that I want to talk about this morning, and that's this. Don't focus on the giant. Focus on God. Don't focus on the giant. Focus on God. Don't compare the giant to yourself. Compare the giant you're facing to the God that you serve. Again, David had to be very aware of his own inferiority in size and strength and skill compared to Goliath. Can you imagine this tiny little shepherd boy who wasn't even big enough and strong enough yet to fight in Saul's army? That's why he wasn't there. He was home as a shepherd. Was so small that he couldn't even, Saul gave him his own armor and he couldn't even wear it. He couldn't even walk in it. And so he takes it off and he simply takes 5 rocks in his shepherd bag and has a staff, and he goes out to face this 9-foot tall giant. Can you imagine? Those things didn't matter to him, though. Because here's what David realized. David realized it wasn't him against this giant. I mean, physically speaking, it was, but it really wasn't him against this giant. It was God at work through him against this giant. That's a huge difference. See, a lot of times we spend so much time focusing on our problems, don't we? And we magnify them so much that they become enormous in our lives. Insurmountable giants. How will we ever live through this situation? How will we ever overcome this? And as we focus on the problems and they become giants in our lives, we lose perspective. And we forget who God is, and we forget what He's capable of. But the truth is, when we shift our focus and we don't spend so much time focusing on the problem, but we focus on God, we focus on His greatness and His majesty and His power and His strength, suddenly it puts our problems in perspective. Suddenly what once seemed enormous and insurmountable, we simply look at it and go, who are you to defy the living God? And that thing that once seemed so big and scary doesn't seem so big and scary anymore. I'm convinced that David wasn't afraid of this giant because he didn't see himself against a great big giant. He saw an enormous, all-powerful God at work within him against a puny little human being who dared to defy him. How dare you? It didn't matter that this guy was physically twice the size of him, because he didn't see himself fighting this giant. He saw this enormous, great big God who had been so faithful over and over and over again. And he recognized the fact, man, this guy is defying God, not us. And God will fight this battle. And he says it, the Lord will fight this battle. The Lord will give you over to us. You come to me with a sword and a spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's army, which is bigger than the biggest sword and the biggest spear you could ever craft. This is the Lord's battle. He will give you to us. Recognize the lies of the enemy. And know the truth. And don't listen to the naysayers when they come, but remember your God stories. And don't focus on the giant. Keep your focus on God. And then it happened. Verse 48. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with a sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath, and David used it to kill him and to cut off his head.